Welcome to the TTT News Special. I'm DK Roster, and we are in the hurricane season, so you'll see an increase in conversations about emergency management and disaster mitigation. But with that in mind, we are happy to speak with the Director of PODS Marketing Mix Limited, Stacey-Ann Pi Osoria. How are you do, Stacey-Ann? Thank you so much for joining us.
Fine, thank you, DK. I'm indoors, I'm not getting wet outside, and I'm safe. Thank God.
It's for real. But the history of PODS, thank you. I want you to take us on a little journey, give us an overview of the company.
Okay, basically back in 2004, PODS, I was introduced to a product which was a self-inflatable sandbag. At that time, Trinidad and Tobago did not experience the type of flooding or the level and intensity of flooding that we have today. We basically would have had 3 inches to 6 inches of water in the road, if so much. But when I saw the bag, I realized that this had huge potential for the residential and commercial sectors, because I realized that with climate change and global warming, that we would eventually need such products and services. So I ventured into the flooding business with my inflatable sandbag, taking it to the 2 disaster management offices, the National Disaster Management Offices. Back then, it was NEMA in Trinidad and NEMA in Tobago. So I would have introduced the bag to both directors back then, Mr. Owen Sandy and Colonel Dave Williams. And off the bat, NEMA in Tobago jumped on it right away. And from then onwards, every year since 2004, they began to procure the bags. And by extension, some of the regional corporations, after the formation of the disaster management units around 2008 thereafter, you found that a lot of the first response agencies began to stock the bags so that in the event of flooding, by that time, we would have had high intensity, more flood waters across the country. They could give out to the public and render some assistance to the public in the event of a national, flooding incident. Also, so when that happened, I began to do a lot of interaction with the first response agencies. And as fate would have it, I am so entrenched with them now, doing a lot of work with the Ministry of Local Government, as well as the National Disaster Office, especially teams, one of my long-standing customers. And venturing into private sector and entrepreneurship, the business began to develop from one step to another. Today, we are now a full-service emergency management consultancy and solutions company, providing not only things like flood inflatable sandbags, but also hardcore flood barriers, which you would see probably at the Arthur Lockjack. You'd see some at UWE, you'd see some in Point Lisas Industrial Estates. So we've gravitated, we've expanded the flood line. And we've also done a lot of work in other niche areas that, for example, the field hospitals that you would have seen recently donated to the country. We did a lot of work, background work behind those field hospitals. We began offering training, something called the Incident Command System. So the company has grown as the disaster management industry has grown. We are still standing here, even though with COVID, it was particularly challenging. We even did some masks. We brought in some masks and provided protection via the KN95s. But it was a rough period during COVID, but we're still standing here and hoping that as the environment, the macro environment demands more mitigation and preparedness, that our services, our products and services can be offered on a much wider scale.
But speaking of your products and services, though, now that we know that global warming and climate change is a thing, and God is a little less of a trini, what determines how it is you grow in terms of saying, okay, well, this is something that we want to get into. This is something we want to expand our range of expertise into what?
DK, I think we still have a very, very long way to go in terms of growth and expansion, because our culture, yes, we know that God may not be a trini right now, but the general public, the general population has not moved. Some have moved. Corporate sector, those who are big on health and safety, or who have legal issues behind, or who are demanding, who have been asked to show emergency management plans, etc., probably are ahead of the game or where they need to be, but the majority of our population is still very much in a reactive mode rather than a proactive one. So I still think we have a lot of work to do, and I know that our government is seeking to do many things to improve, even from a governmental standpoint, because from a public sector standpoint, because the last year, if you would recall, was the first year they dedicated the month of May. They declared the month of May the month in observance for disaster risk reduction. In addition to that, at the national level, we have going on disaster management policy development and an update to the legislation. So as that progresses, as things at the national level progresses, and as the macro environment, climate change and global warming keeps demanding that we need to stop and think about where we're at, until we take that cognizance, we really have a long way to go, but I'm hoping that now it would be at a faster rate than what it was before. And as that happens, you will find the need for these products and services more and more.
And I like the fact that you speak about products and services. I think we have about 1 more minute on this side. So, and I just want you to speak a little bit to who are, in the main, your customers. Because originally you said at the start, it was more disaster management agencies. But then you said that increased a bit, including some of the places from around the regional corporations. But who in the main forms the
I think the bulk of my customers is still corporate TNT, because, for example, they would recognize the loss of revenue or the loss of downtime or the loss of inconvenience, where health and safety is concerned, that if anything happens on their premises, that staff, that their community, that their investment in their operations need to be protected. So by far, I would say with the flood protection line, that is where we do the bulk of the work. We would have done like TNTech substations. We would have even done hurricane shutters for power gen, penal plant. So again, that health and safety regulation that corporate TNT needs to follow, needs to be cognizant of, and needs to be in line with. They take provisions for such, and therefore, try to put aside the necessary funding. Again, with respect to the disaster management offices, your team is my long-standing customer. Before, with my flood line houses, you find the average household would have spent some money to put some flood barriers for their homes. But the cost of flood barriers is a very ticklish product, and the cost of flood barriers now have gone up so much that it really does not make economical sense, and therefore they would probably have to resort to inflatable sandbags.
And these are some of the things that we want to talk about when we return, Stacey-Ann.
So just, are we in that frame of mind to
so Stacey-Ann, just putting a little break, and we are going to be coming back and we continue the conversation when we return, because we also saw some images of field stations or field kits that were erected, and I want to get into that when we return, but stay with us. Welcome back. We are speaking with Stacey-Ann Pi Osoria, the Director of PODS Marketing Mix Limited. And Stacey-Ann, you were just talking about the difference between different types of systems, for want of a better term. So the Sandbag system, explain how that works, please, because sometimes I think it is kind of mind-blowing to say, okay, well, these things are separate, and if we put them together without anything in between them, like mortar or whatever, they're going to do the job. So describe that system for me, thanks.
So these modern type sandbags are not very new technology. It's been out for quite some time. But basically it replaces sand with a special resin that once that resin comes into contact with water, that resin will begin to change its chemical composition and begin to suck and swell and expand. So a 1 pound, a bag that you would have uninflated, stored for emergency use, goes from 1 pound up to 50 pounds in weight. Thereby you can build in advance, you can pre-inflate these bags and build your barrier, which are also more flexible in nature, so that when you have general sandbags with sand, they're sort of rigid. But with these inflatable sandbags, the resin is sort of squishy and flexible. It's similar to what's in baby Pampers. And so they suck and swell and they contour to the shape of the opening, and you can push it under your doorway, tuck it under your doorway. And as water comes in, you already have your barrier and you keep the water out. So that's, you would see there in the pictures where we would have stacked when we did the testing in Tobago. They would have put me in a 4-foot sloping drain with water to test the bags. And so we've been selling these bags ever since 2004.
No,
So it is very useful if you have something stored at a moment's notice. I had somebody from Maraval, a shop owner, wish he had it before the floods. It's just something, it's a small investment that could save you a lot of hassle in the long run and money and headache.
I like the fact that you speak about baby Pampers. Baby Pampers is a one-time use. Yes. Can these sandbags be used more than once?
We market it as a one-time use product only. However, when it's inflated, it can remain up for several weeks. Depending on the humidity, depending on the moisture outside, that will determine how long they stay up. But they really are treated as emergency use. When you really need it at that last minute and you don't have anything, you pull it out and it can create that barrier of protection for you. So if we have, let's say we have rain today and rain tomorrow, you can reuse your bag tomorrow. So it just depends on how much of the water is evaporated out of it and if it goes down and the resin is compromised. But definitely we treat it as a one-time use product only.
All right, now I'm looking at the time we have, and there are two burning questions I want to get in. One, the members of your team and their areas of expertise. And two, there are some structures that we would have seen outside the Jean-Pierre complex, mobile shelter units. Did you have any involvement in those? If so, what?
So back in 2012, again, when the Ministry of Local Government set up the 14 disaster management units, at that time, they were looking for mobile shelters to use as incident command posts if they needed to set up an operation. NEMA, again in Tobago, had one of these shelters, and I was the distributor, appointed the distributor. So Tobago would have received a shelter way before 2012. Since then, I've been doing a lot of groundwork until I was able to supply the Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government with some of these shelters, which we used for disaster management. But they are turnkey solutions, and as you can see, they can be built out into field hospitals. So what I would have done a fair amount of work over the years, I would have taken up people from different government ministries and agencies up to the factory. We would have promoted the product. We would have had numerous workshops. We would have had numerous discussions. And when COVID-19 hit last year, of course, the discussion surrounding field hospitals intensified. So I would have done a lot of the groundwork. I would have worked with the Ministry of Health Disaster Management Coordinator up to 3 years ago, trying to get our ministry to understand the importance of this type of equipment, the specialized equipment. So even though this was a donation by the US government, a lot of groundwork, substantial groundwork was laid out by our company promoting the use of mobile shelter systems. It was even pitched for Carnival, where you would see NCC would set up a number of tents in the savannah. We would have also set up there and pitched it to them as a new face, a new type of tent system that is of much higher quality, that lasts longer, and that can give the comfort that the users would want in such systems.
And even before we talk about the team, and your train of conversation leads me to ask the question, do you decide, I'm bringing this, and let me bring this in and tout the value, show the value, or is it that an agency says, you'll try this now and let us know if it's working? What determines that process?
It works all those ways. It works where, because I've been going to disaster management conferences for a number of years. I'm in a lot of networks. I've been introduced to a number of vendors who want to do business in Trinidad. But it would also mean talking to the customer and finding out, what do the customers want? What do the ministries need? What stage are they at? What are they looking for? Or it would be me saying, I think this is a very good idea. I think I need to introduce it to them and get some feedback, and it would take off the ground. So it's a number of factors. It's not one hard and fast rule. It's constant communication, scanning the environment, having your discussions, and really, determining what is needed when. But again, as the world is turning, as nature is changing, as global warming and climate change, there is a higher demand for such products and services, and we need to shift from being reactive after the floods to investing in the right mitigation and preparedness tools up front, which would mean penny wise, pound foolish, from reactive to proactive, and saving a lot more money up front in investing in things in advance of incidents and events happening.
And how do people engage with you to make this sort of investments, Stacey-Ann?
I've been in business since 2004, so many people would just have my cell contact. They pass on the information. I do have a website, podstt.com, but basically it's more or less is one-on-one. It more is a one-on-one personal selling, because it's niched, it's very specialized, it requires, a certain level of interaction. You're not going into a grocery to buy a loaf of bread. So it is a different type of business. It's also, as I said, it's growing, but it's still relatively small. But as we progress, hopefully that's going to change, and there's going to be a lot more corporate, a lot more citizens with the education. Every year we have the month of May, heightening the education, training and education. You also have a lot more NGOs on the ground now pushing and advocating for disaster management, mitigation and preparedness. So with all things being equal, all stakeholders coming together, as it evolves, you will find the system strengthening and getting better and better as we move from that reactive response and recovery to more mitigation and preparedness, so that response and recovery is so much better in the end.
All right, so we have less than a minute now, but you're not doing this by yourself. Who are some of those people who are putting in this effort with you? Who are some of the members of your team?
So I have some consultants who work with me, very seasoned and expert consultants who've been in the industry for a number of years, both local and international. Those would include Mr. Owen Sandy, as I would have mentioned his name. He was one of the previous directors of TEMA. I have Colonel Dave Williams, who sat at NEMA Trinidad, who sat at Ministry of Rural Development and Local Government, and ODPM. I have, for business continuity, we have a cadre of local providers as well. All consultants, as projects come in, we would pull together the right team. I also have OFDA and FEMA certified instructors. So incident command system training, which we really didn't get into, but that's one of the more training areas and service areas that we provide. We have a cadre of FEMA certified instructor out in the US.
And possibly that is something that we can speak about on the next side or the next conversation, because really we are in the season for it, and this is something that needs to happen with much more frequency. But we want to thank you so much for being a part of it, for making the time. And on behalf of the entire news team, thank you for joining us at the TTT News Special.